Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines unchanged. So for exam number 1, quizzes part 2, complete those by October 19th at end of day. Again, exam number 1 was due before, but due dates are when we're done with something, and so they're like, you probably should do it by then. And the deadlines are always, if you don't have it done by then, when you go to look on Blackboard, it will be gone. Like the chances of the Yankees winning the Super Bowl. True. They can never win the Super Bowl, which is sad. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th, a day that should live in infamy. And exam 5, the final, covering all the things, if you need it, deadlines at 5 p.m. And all the rest of these are end of day. For the paper, draft deadline is November 9th. There's the due date for the draft, and again, due dates are, if you should probably have it done by then, and deadlines are when you gotta have it done by, because if you don't have it done by then, it's not done. And so if you need a particular grade in the class, I have the draft due date for that.
And the draft was 6 to 8 pages?
Yeah, but the same length of the same as an oral paper. You can do less, like if you want, if you get to the point where I wonder, say, I wonder if this is any good, and before I spend more time on it, I want to see if I'm going in the right direction, you can turn that in. So you can always turn in whatever you've got. You don't have to wait till you're done. For the +5 deadline, which is your base score +5 for being on time, November 14th, the emergency deadline, a week later for full credit in case something goes wrong, November 21st, and of course the desperation deadline for 50% credit, December 8th. And these are all, well, these 3 are end of day. People would ask me, like, what's the paper about? And the way to find out is, if you go on Blackboard and you go to the paper guide, it goes through step by step how to do the paper, including a rubric. Also, I went over it, we spent a class going over it. So if you go to the video for that day, you can go through it quickly, if you wish, and it has goes through step by step how to do the paper. Before pressing on to new stuff, namely more of our good dead friends and Anselm, anything about any previous stuff, or stuff to be, or paper, or anything that needs stuff. Okay. So this time we're looking at our good dead friend, Saint Anselm, talking about trying to prove God a priori. And as we saw back in the ancient days of Friday, if you're proving something a priori, what are you using? Just your reason. In this case, come up with a definition and just see where reason takes one. And 2 of the big camps when it comes to proving stuff are the empiricists, who say if you're going to prove something is real, there's got to be ultimately an empirical foundation. You've got to be able to trace it back to some perception. And again, it could involve technology like a microscope or radio telescope or something, but ultimately there's going to be some empirical evidence. The rationalists, though, say by pure reason, by thinking about it, you could prove the existence of stuff. And it's still a battle going on today. Can you just sit down, do some equations and some math and prove other dimensions or possible worlds, or do you need some empirical observation? Okay, so we're at the start of his argument, and he begins, as most of these arguments begin, with a definition of God. And so the way he gets it going a priori is instead of saying, I've observed this, and then this must be God, like our good dead friend Thomas Aquinas will argue, he starts off, here is how God is defined, and from that definition, he thinks he can prove not only does God exist, but God must exist, he can't not exist, and this only applies to God. So his definition is this: God is a being which nothing greater can be conceived. So he doesn't just mean like the greatest thing I can think of, or the greatest thing Donald Trump can think of. He means literally, if an entity could think of a being that is greater, that being they're thinking of something greater than is not God. And one way to look at it more, I guess more pragmatically, is it would be the greatest being, a perfect, utterly perfect being, because there could be nothing greater. Now, since he's trying to prove God's existence, he has to have a foil, a opponent and nemesis. And of course, to avoid being accused of atheism, even the slightest chance, he refers to the person denying God's existence as the fool. And the fool says, there is no God. So how is Anselm, from his definition, going to convince the fool that not only does God exist, that God must exist, can't not exist, and this only applies to God? Well, here's how he does it. He would speak to the fool and would note that if the fool is asked, "Fool, do you understand this definition?" And the fool, of course, understands it. Now, he then says, perfect theme music, that the dream of the fool, so here's the fool, and the fool is the understanding, like in the fool's mind. So Anselm has said to the fool, God is perfect being. And the fool has, in his understanding, this notion. I'll just symbolize it as God instead of writing out all that stuff. So he's got the idea of God existing in his understanding. He understands the definition. Now, we know, of course, from tragic disappointment in life, that it's one thing to be like an idea, for something to be in our understanding, and quite another to understand that something exists. Or put another way, it's one thing to be in our mind, another thing to be real. Now, is that true? Well, can we think of things that don't exist out in the world, don't exist out there? Yeah, I mean, we can use, fantastic examples. We can think of, mythical beasts, dragons and unicorns and wyrens and so forth. And they don't exist, in many cases, fortunately, out in the world. And of course, we can think of like mundane things that do exist, but we don't have. For example, could you picture yourself holding millions of dollars? And all your student loans paid off? Yeah, you can picture that, but of course, it's one thing to have it in your mind, quite another to have it, existing for real. Now, to illustrate this, he uses an analogy, because one way I guess you get your philosopher's card is using a certain number of analogies, kind of like a punch card for like loyalty rewards. So he uses a painter analogy. Now, before a painter paints, and they're thinking of the painting, where is what they're painting? They're in their mind. They're thinking what they're going to draw and paint. And then, of course, when they finally paint it, they create the painting for real. So it's one thing to be in the mind, another to be out there in the world. And of course, we get that distinction. Some people don't. There are people who have, I think it's was it psychosis or I can't remember the exact name, but there are conditions where people think like what's in their head is weird. Paranoia, for example, example of that. And so we know this distinction. So at this point, Anselm thinks, okay, so far so good. What does he get? Well, his definition: the fool understands this concept, and the fool agrees, okay, I got this in my understanding, or put more formally, he's got the idea in his mind. So how is he going to get from the fool agreeing to this, yeah, I'm thinking about this thing, to prove it? Well, here's how he does it. If you understand something, it's in your understanding, kind of by definition. It's kind of like if you get a picture of something in your phone, it's in your phone. That's how it works. So here's how he works is logical magic to show that if you understand his definition of God, that you have to accept that God exists. Here's how he does it. God, as he defines it, again, is a being of which you can't think of anything greater. So if you can think of something greater, what you're thinking of is not God. So how's it going to work? Well, here's how he does it. If this being, God, is just in your understanding, then his claim is it's not the greatest being. there's something, you can think of something great. Namely, something that is this, but exists for real. And God existing for real, roughly put, is greater than God just being in your imagination. Now, we can illustrate this or support it. Can use an example that doesn't involve like God. Think about money. Suppose I go to the bank and say, I'd like to deposit $1 million. And the teller's like, oh, I'm excited, give me a bonus or something. And I say, and they say, oh, great. You know, they look at me and they say, oh, I guess you have it like in a check or something. I'm like, no, in my mind. I'm going to deposit the $1 million in my mind, and you're fine back. And how would that go? How would that play out over the next few minutes? Yeah, it might involve the police at some point, or at least you know, Health and Human Services. Yeah, so the money in my mind is worth how much? Yeah, it's worth $0. The mental money. But dollars for real, if I say just kidding, you know, take out a check for $1 million, then they'd be like, oh, okay, a little weird, but that's real money. Yeah, so $1 million in my hand is worth way more than $1 million in my mind. And actually, a penny in my hand is worth more than $1 million in my mind. Which could be a good song title, perhaps, or a good song, but anyways. So, if God just exists in understanding, it's not the greatest being, because there's something you can think of greater than existing for real. I mean, going back to the money analogy, you can always think of like a greater amount of money than the money you're thinking about in your mind, which would be real money. Any amount of real money is greater than just imaginary money. So then how does this prove that God exists? Well, here's how it goes. So, if God exists just in your mind, then you can think of a greater being. Again, God existing for real. So then, if God doesn't exist out here, this idea has got to be wrong. You know, by the definition, it has to be the greatest being you can think of. And if you can only think of it being, you know, God existing in your mind, but not for real, you can think of something greater, God for real, and by definition, God is the greatest, so God has to exist. Because if he didn't exist for real, and just exists in your mind, he wouldn't be the greatest. Kind of crudely put, here's like the super condensed Reader's Digest version. Basically what he's saying is God is perfect. And if he didn't exist, and he was just in your mind, he wouldn't be perfect, so it wouldn't be God. So if he is perfect, he's got to exist. Because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does. So at this point he says, God has to exist for real, and yeah, you know, he exists in our understanding, because we have the idea of him, but he also has to exist for real. Now at this point you may think he would, you know, say, well, approve God, time to, it's, you know, Miller time, or time to go to Disney, or wherever people do to celebrate proving God's existence. But this isn't enough for him. You may wonder, come on, you just thought you proved God's existence. Why isn't that enough? Well, here's why. He wants to go beyond that, because all he's done at this point is shown that God does exist. But he wants more. What more could he want? Well, he wants to prove that you can't even think of God not existing. In other words, not only does God exist, you can't even deny his existence without, I mean, you can say the words, but your brain, if you're trying to think about it, your mind just can't do it. So how does he do that? Well, he says that this being, God, exists so truly, you can't even rationally think of God not existing. Now, of course, someone might say, well, yeah, I can think those words. You know, if you have someone who's an atheist, they're like, yeah, I can think of God not existing. And Anselm says, well, when you try to do it, you really can't do it. It's like someone saying, well, I can think of a square circle. It's like, you can say the words, but you really can't do it. So here's how he does it. he claims it's possible to conceive of a being, that which cannot be conceived not to exist. And this being, of course, is greater than a being you can think of non-existent. So what he's doing is kind of the same game. Like he said, okay, God for real is greater than imaginary God. So God's got to exist, otherwise he wouldn't be God. Now, a being you could think of non-existent. So if you could think of God non-existing, you can still think of a greater being, namely a being that you can't even think of non-existent. It's impossible to think of it not being. And that being would be greater because, well, you can think of this one non-existing, and one you can't even think of as non-existing would be even more awesome, even more great. So, if you can think of the greatest being possible as non-existing, it wouldn't be the greatest being. It'd be a being greater. Namely, a being just like that, with the added feature of being such that you can't think of it non-existent. You'd have that extra more to it. And so, it must exist, and you can't even think of it not existing. Because if you could think of it not existing, you're not thinking of the greatest being, or so he claims. Now this of course may seem like, word trickery, which some people think, it's all word trickery. And others say, wow, this is super, super brilliant. And sometimes it's hard to tell. Before pressing on though, anything about what he's doing, the mental gymnastics he's doing. So crudely put, kind of smushed down version way to more easily track it is God's perfect, so he's got to exist, because if he didn't exist he would be perfect, so he's got it. And of course you can't think of God not existing, because if you could think of him not existing, he wouldn't be perfect, so you can't think of him not existing, because if you could he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so you can't. If you're thinking of something not existing, as we see, you're not thinking of God. Now, at this point you may think, okay, Anselm, you prove God exists, or he thinks he's proven that you can't even think of God not existing, and you may think, okay, that's enough. Surely, time to stop doing this. But wait, as they say, there is more. Now, he wants to say that not only does God exist, not only can you not think of God not existing, but this only applies to God. Because he doesn't want other stuff having this quality. Because some clever person would come along and say, well, could there be other stuff, something else that has these same qualities, that's where you end up having multiple gods. So some clever polytheist, they come along and try to sneak in other stuff. You got to stop those clever polytheists because they're always up to something. So at this point, he believes God exists. You can't even think of non-existent. So atheists are doing the impossible. They're trying to be atheists, but they really can't. So how does he get the idea that this only applies to God? Well, this one's a little less, persuasive, but here's how it goes. If you could think of something better than God, the creature, he claims, would rise above its creator, which is impossible. Because as he sees it, in a way this may seem like a bit circular, because he claims everything you got except for God, you can think of as not existing. So this only applies to God. Because everything else, and this may seem kind of weird, because normally we talk about existence, we think of existence as like a light switch, it exists or doesn't. But as we'll say, we talk about Thomas Aquinas, ancient thinkers, going back to our good friend Plato, believe that there was degrees of reality, things being more real or less real. And he thinks that beings that are lesser than God exist in a way that's less real. Which may seem kind of weird, because you think of things being like real or not real. But the way the ancients and medievals use the term real would be sort of analogous to the way we use the term today, like power. Like if you ever played video games with like characters with different power levels, It's like God's got the greatest, power of all, and lesser creatures have like lesser abilities. Or like to use a movie analogy. You have like the main characters who are like kind of unkillable no matter what, and then you have the poor, extras that get killed all the time. And so the main actors are way more real because they don't die. And so he concludes that this only applies to God. And again, this in a way seems a bit circular because he's kind of saying, well, it only applies to God because everything else would be created and wouldn't be God. Then, of course, he addresses the question, why is the fool? And, of course, because he denies God, and he denies God because he's the fool. So that's Anselm's argument, the classic ontological argument, in which he thinks he proves that God exists, God cannot not exist, and this only applies to God. And again, it's kind of weird. You think, all you need is the first one, God exists, but it's really important to the medieval thinkers that God not only does exist, but he's got to exist. We'll see more of this in the future, but it's what's called a necessary being, that there couldn't be a world without God. And of course, it can't apply to other things besides God, because, as we'll see, that can be a problem. Now, even in his own time, Anselm's answering did not go unanswered. And along came a fellow named Gaunilo, who was also a monk, who challenged Anselm. Now, you may wonder, why would a fellow monk, who presumably believes in God, why would he raise a challenge against Anselm? Well, it's not because he wants to prove that God doesn't exist, because he's a monk and presumably believes in God. His dispute, his problem is with Anselm's argument. So, why would he raise such a challenge? Well, this points out something that's rather important for how philosophy is done. Namely this. In reasoning, you can agree with someone's conclusion. You could agree that God exists or agree in a particular thing, but that doesn't mean that you have to accept all of the arguments someone gives for a position you agree with. So you could believe in a position, if you believe in a viewpoint, but that does not require that you accept every argument that comes along, because the arguments for what you believe could be terrible. So if someone believes in God, they're not obligated to accept every single argument that purports to be trying to prove God's existence. Likewise for any belief. Just because you believe something doesn't mean that every argument for that belief is therefore good. You can still believe it and accept that the arguments are for, at least some of them are terrible. So his fight is not with God's existence. His dispute is with Anselm's argument. So Gaunilo is not trying to say, there is no God. He's trying to say, yeah, there's a God, of course. Monks believe in it. But he's saying that Anselm's argument doesn't work. So Gaunilo puts forth the following challenge. And this gets echoed later by our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. So what Anselm has done is said, okay, there's this being, you can't even conceive of it, it's the most greatest being, you can't conceive of a greater one, therefore, it's got to exist. Now Gaunilo, and we'll see this echoed by Kant, later on, he says, sure, I can accept thinking of this being. I understand the words. Being nothing greater can be conceived, blah, blah, blah. But he claims, I don't accept that it's real until it's been proven. And he doesn't think that merely saying it's the greatest being proves it. So what's his doubt? Well, Gaunilo, again, he's not doubting God's existence. His fight is with Anselm's argument. Anselm claims, the being's got to exist, because if it didn't exist, it would be the greatest, but it is, so it's got to exist. Gaunilo doubts that this being, that which nothing greater can conceive, is greater than any real object. Essentially what he's arguing is the argument doesn't work. And he says the only existence it's got is when your mind, when you hear a word, where you try to imagine or picture what it might be. I always think of, like Lewis Carroll's, you know, the Alice in Wonderland, the Jabberwock, etc. I was wondering, what's a Jabberwock look like? And you kind of like picture it, you know, or other things, you know, other weird, seemingly nonsensical things. For a book or a poem, people try to like picture what it might be. And Gaunilo basically says, yeah, you know, you get this word, I try to picture it, but it doesn't really prove that it exists. Its only reality is kind of a picture in my mind. Now, what he thinks that Anselm should do is that he thinks what's going on is basically this. Simply saying, okay, it's the greatest thing, so it exists, he thinks that doesn't work. And he claims that even being in his understanding doesn't prove it, because what he needs, again, is that Anselm's got to prove there is a being that exists, and then he would be willing to accept that, yes, it's the greatest of all, so it is this necessary being. So it's a challenge that this reply later gets stolen by Kant and repackaged, which we'll see in the future. We're essentially saying, yeah, if he proved it to me the greatest being exists, I'll accept that being is the greatest being. Yeah. To use a crappy analogy, it'd be kind of like, think of like a figure called a billigon that has a billion sides. Now, do we know what that means? Yeah, billigon's got a billion sides. But does one exist somewhere? Maybe. There'd be a lot of sides to it. So we know what it is, but we don't know that it exists. But we do know that if it did exist, it would have a billion sides. But we don't know if it exists. So Gaunilo's kind of saying, well, yeah, if there's a greatest being, then it's got all these cool qualities, but just calling it the greatest being doesn't prove it exists. Then he advances what made him famous, but not famous enough to be a saint. So I guess Anselm still kind of wins, because they're both dead, but Anselm is a saint, and being a dead saint is, I guess, the best way to be dead. So Gaunilo puts forth his famous perfect island argument, and he says this: imagine that there is a perfect island. Now, if someone said to you, perfect island, you'd know what was meant. The island part's easy. An island is a body of land completely surrounded by water, and perfect, of course, means perfect. So we know what the words mean. We'd say, yes, perfect island, gotcha. Now, what he engages in here is a method called parity, as opposed to parody of reasoning. Now, a parody is, of course, what? If you're parodying something, you're mocking. You're creating a kind of distorted, exaggerated version to make fun of it. Now, with parity of reasoning, parity means on par. So the method is essentially this. If you're using a parity of reasoning argument, you would present the same sort of reasoning, and then show, if you want to say the reasoning is good, you would say, well, I'm using the same reasoning as this other argument. This reasoning is pretty clearly good, so the argument itself is good. More commonly, though, it's used as an attack form. So what you do is, if you want to criticize an argument, you build an argument that uses the same logic, same reasoning, and then show that this, in this case, it seems absurd. So if the reasoning is defective here, then the same reasoning would also be defective over here. Now then the battle becomes, basically it's a battle of analogy. So you'd argue by analogy, this argument is terrible, this argument is like this terrible argument, so this argument is terrible as well. And then the fight would be, are they really alike? So what he's trying to do is build an obviously bad argument to show that by using the same reasoning as Anselm, build a terrible, obviously bad argument to show that Anselm's reasoning is bad. This can also be done outside of philosophy. So if someone's got like a plan, you can like you could take their plan and show like how it would be incredibly stupid in like another case and say, yeah, we should definitely not So here's how it would go. He says, suppose we get this idea of perfect island. And he claims, because of this, given Anselm's reasoning, you can't doubt that this island exists. Why not? Well, you understand the terms, perfect island, and using his reasoning, here's how it would go. Anselm says, you think of, perfect God. So he's got to exist, because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect. He wouldn't be the greatest being. So you just plug in here, the perfect island, the greatest island. Well, which is greater? An island existing in your mind, or an island existing for real? And for example, suppose, winter break comes up, and someone asks you, where are you going? And you say, I'm going to this perfect island. And the person says, where is it? You say, in my mind. I'm going on an imagination in my mind. And the person would probably be like, that's so sad. That person can't afford to go anywhere. Yeah, so if someone was going on an imagination to the perfect island in their mind, they would be going nowhere. Yeah, so the island for real would be greater than the island just in the mind, so the perfect island's got to exist. Because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be perfect, but it is, so it does. Now, Gaunilo doesn't run this to the obvious levels of possible absurdity, but you could plug anything in there. Just stick perfect in front of it. Put in perfect kiwi, the fruit and the bird. The perfect ostrich, the perfect, hot pocket, such a thing as possible. The perfect, just whatever you want, because it would work for everything. And that would lead to an even more absurd result, because if just calling something perfect proves that it exists, the world would be full of perfect things. They'd be all over the place. But is that the case? Sadly, no. You may search for the perfect hot pocket, but you shall never find it. Sadly. Yeah, and so his argument seems pretty good, because the end result essentially is his conclusion that if you could go around, proving stuff just by calling it perfect, you could prove anything, and that is clearly crazy. It just doesn't work. So what he's doing essentially, his methodology is combining this parity of reasoning, basically, recreating the same reasoning, and our good friend, the reducing to absurdity. So essentially, if we use this method, we can prove the existence of perfect anything. Just stick perfect in front of it and prove it. And he says that is absurd. So by parity of reasoning and reducing to absurdity, he concludes that Anselm's argument fails. Now Anselm, of course, doesn't give up. But before going to Anselm's counterpunch, anything about Gaunilo's attack that needs more Gaunilo? So Anselm replies back, and here's what he does. First thing he does is summarize the argument again, the gist of the perfect island argument, and what he essentially is going to say is, spoiler alert, the gist of his argument is it only works for God, it doesn't work for islands. And Anselm sort of anticipated this problem because his third thing was first God exists, second God must exist, he cannot exist, and then thirdly it only applies to God. So what he's going to do is try to double down on it only applies to God, because if he can do that, then he cuts off Gaunilo's argument. Because if he can show, you can't just call something perfect and prove it exists, except for God, then he can perhaps succeed. That's his goal. So his challenge back is this. If anyone came up with anything existing in reality or in the mind, to which he can apply this reasoning, he will discover it. So that's the challenge. So how does Anselm get back at Gaunilo? Well, basically this. Firstly, he sort of just repeats. God cannot be conceived not to being, because he essentially he's going to be, maybe a little unfair but accurate, is that essentially saying because, God. Because basically God is so assuredly God, otherwise it wouldn't exist at all, but he does, etc. So rehashes that. So what's kind of his real non-rehasher reply, which also kind of rehashes, well, this dilemma thing. Now what he lays out is a dilemma for Gaunilo. And the idea being in this case is that there's two options, and either way Gaunilo's going to be wrong. Here's how he does it. Now, when making the attack, there's two options for Gaunilo. One is he is actually conceiving of nothing greater can be conceived as being, and conceiving that being not to exist. Or he's not conceiving of that being and he's mistaken, and he's thinking of something else not existing. And that's true. I mean, he's either thinking of, God not existing, or he's got it wrong. He's thinking of something else not existing. So as Anselm says it, so if one claims that he conceives this being not to exist, at the time when he conceives of this, either he conceives of a being in which a greater is inconceivable, or he doesn't conceive of at all. To use a metaphor or analogy, it'd be like if someone denied that triangles have three sides. And there's two possibilities. One is that they really aren't denying that triangles have three sides. The other is that they're denying something has three sides, and they think it's a triangle, but they're wrong. That they're actually thinking of like a square. So Gaunilo says, you get these two options. You're thinking of God, or you're not. So if you're not thinking about God, then you're not thinking about the non-existence of God. When you go back to the triangle analogy, if someone says, yeah, triangles definitely don't have three sides, definitely four sides, you say to them, you say, well, so what's a triangle? And you say, and you draw, and you say, yeah, it's definitely a triangle. You say, what's this? And you're like, square. You go, you get the words wrong. You're thinking of, you're not denying that triangles have three sides, you think squares are triangles. Okay, no problem. So in that case, there's no problem, because if he's not thinking of nothing greater can be conceived, then he's not thinking of that thing not existing. He's just wrong. Now, he claims, the second part of the dilemma, if the Anselm is conceiving of this being, nothing greater can be conceived, then he conceives of a being which cannot even be conceived not to exist. If it can be conceived not to exist, it could be conceived as having a beginning and an end. But this is impossible. Or so he claims. Now, so the gist of that second part there is that if the person's not thinking about God, roughly put, then they're not denying God. The person says, God doesn't exist. You say, what do you mean by God? I mean, a fire-breathing, lizard-like thing that flies around. Like, you're thinking of dragons. Yeah, they don't exist. Now, the person is thinking about God, and some claims they can't be thinking about him not existing, because in order to do that, he would have to be thinking of God having a beginning and an end, to say that God, could be thought of as not existing, but that can't be done. Now this, of course, runs into problems because, well, if you're saying, I can think of a being and deny that it exists without talking about it having a beginning or an end, I can just say there just isn't, there just isn't such a thing. And Anselm would reply back, well, in the case of God, deny God, you have to conceive of God having a beginning and an end, and that becomes a little less certain. So, not a super strong reply. But he thinks that, it works. Then he finishes up with his third part of his reply, which is this. If you're thinking of, what he calls God, you're thinking of a being which you can't even think of not existing. So if you conceive of this being, you don't conceive that it does not exist, because if you do, you conceive the inconceivable. The non-existence of that which a greater cannot be conceived is inconceivable. Now, this seems to essentially be saying, kind of it comes down to, Anselm says, you can't, and Gaunilo says, yeah, I can. And so it would seem to be a matter of which is more plausible. So which one wins? Well, obviously Anselm, same. Okay, so the recap of that basically again is, Anselm says, crudely put, God is perfect, he's got to exist, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does. And since he's perfect, he also can't not exist, because if he could not exist, he wouldn't be as perfect as a being that could not exist. So he's got to be such that he's not only exists, but he's got to exist and he can't not exist. And this only applies to God, because it applied to other things, they'd be greater than God, and that can't be. Now, of course, he leaves open the possibility that they could be like equal to God, so it doesn't bring that out. Gaunilo replies back, well, if you're just going to call things perfect and take it to prove they exist, that applies to everything, which is crazy. And Anselm replies back, it only applies to God, because you can't deny God's existence, because it's inconceivable, you can't even think that. And his reply really doesn't seem super great, but at least he does have a reply. So that finishes up our Anselm Gaunilo paper that we found. Before moving on, anything about it that needs more stuff? Now, the ontological argument, again, remains super popular to this day. People still, they'll break it on debates over God's existence. Someone always will break out that ontological argument. And it was stolen later on borrowed and repainted later on by other philosophers, like our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and our good dead friend Descartes. So, get a lot of mileage out of that. We now turn to our second saint, Saint Thomas Aquinas, as no one, I guess, probably called it. Born in 1224, died in 1274, and of course, being a saint, is still totally dead. He was born into a noble family, a younger son of the Count of Aquino, hence Aquinas. He had kind of a weird backstory. His family wanted him to go into, the church, but he wanted to go into a monkish order dedicated to charity and learning. And his family said, that's not what the church is for. The church is for getting power. Because they wanted him to become like a powerful member of the church. And back then, the church, the Catholic Church in Europe, was exceptionally powerful. And so, if a noble family or wealthy family had multiple sons, they typically did. You always want, as I said, an heir or a spare, because death was pretty common back then, at a young age. And so what they try to do is, their oldest son, they'd marry off to someone else's land to double up their land, and their younger son, they try to get them into a position in the church, because they had a great deal of authority. The one you're not going to marry off. Now he said, no, I want to go join this monkish order where they study stuff and they do good works, and so they locked him in a tower, kind of a Rapunzel scenario, but without the hair. And they kept him there for quite some time, and he refused to relent. And since he was family, they couldn't really kill him. This wasn't Game of Thrones, you just kill everybody. And they said, okay, go for it. Which was a good choice, because no one really remembers the other sons of the Count of Aquino, or really the Count of Aquino. They remember Thomas Aquinas, so I guess for the win. Now his teacher was a fellow named Albert the Great, because he was Albert and great. He had a couple objectives. One of his big objectives was this. The church, even before the Protestant Reformation, had been split. The Roman Empire, of course, the Western Roman Empire fell, about 434 AD. Rome finally collapsed for the last time. But of course, Constantinople in the east kept the Roman Empire going another 1,000 years. Finally fall into the Turks, and of course was renamed as which is still the capital, I believe, of Turkey today, which is, of course, Istanbul, which is also a They Might Be Giants song, Constantinople, Istanbul, which is an old song, so not super old, kind of old. Now, the Eastern Church separated from the Western Church and is known still to this day, the Eastern Orthodox Church. If you ever seen pictures of like Russia, and they have the churches with the big onion domes, that's the Eastern Orthodox, style, those cool onion domes. Now, it was a separate church with its own leadership, and still today, you have the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then of course all the many varieties of Protestantism. Back when Thomas was Thomasing, those are the two main divisions. There were some heresies and minor sects, but the big ones were the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox. And he wanted to reunite the church. And of course, how'd that work out? No, it didn't. But at least, been a long time since we've had a Christian religious war, so good. Yeah, a really long time. I think the last one was maybe the 30 Years' War. Yeah, they kind of ended it. So good. Now, at the end of his life, after writing tons and tons of stuff, he had a mystical experience that, on one hand, cool. On the other hand, his experience made him believe that all of his work was like straw, basically worthless, which is kind of sad. Spend your whole life doing something, and then the second realize everything you did didn't matter. He was canonized in 1323, in the process of becoming a saint, and he was, in 1879, Pope Leo XIII presented him as a model of Catholic thought. So, really successful. Now, in his youth, he had a nickname, specifically the Ox. Sometimes referred to as the Gentle Ox, because he was kind of, gentle and slow, didn't talk a lot, but this hid a wicked wit. Because one of the stories about him was he was at a monastery and his fellow monks played a trick on him and said, Thomas, Thomas, there's a cow flying over the monastery. And he runs to the window to look and they say, silly Thomas, how could you believe that a cow could fly? And he said back to them, I would rather believe that a cow could fly than a fellow Christian would lie to me. So, pretty good bird. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today and the story of the ox. Next time, more stuff.